Okay, we are continuing our journey through the Bible, and we are up to signpost number 2, which we started last week and we're going to complete today. And at the end of today's lesson, we continue on the journey and we will be stopping at signpost 3. But just as a bit of a reminder, signpost number 2 covers a very large section in the book of Genesis, and that's Genesis 12 to 50. And like the first signpost, there are 4 key areas that we consider. The first signpost looked at 4 major events, and the second signpost introduces us to 4 major individuals. And the family that we're looking at is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. At least that's the emphasis that we see in the book of Genesis. Now, today, what we're going to do is we're going to be examining briefly the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But before we do that, let's remind ourselves why that is important. Because the key individual here is Abraham, and that's why we spent a whole lesson on him last week. Abraham is the man that God chose. Abraham had come from a pagan family, a family where his dad actually worshipped the moon and other such things. We learn this in the book of Joshua, chapter 24 and verse 2. And this family was a pagan family, but God had spoken to Abraham. In God's sovereign grace and initiative, he sought him out. And he made a promise to Abraham saying, I will make you great, and through you the nations are going to be blessed. In other words, what God is saying to Abraham is that sin has come into this world by means of the rebellion of Adam and Eve. But God made a promise to Adam and Eve that he will have a descendant. The seed of the woman will ultimately come and will crush the serpent's head. In order for this to be fulfilled, we need to see this occur through a line of descendants. And God says to Abraham, it's through you that this is going to happen. It is through your descendants. Now, Abraham, when he was called to leave his homeland, was 75 years old. He and his wife were beyond the years of having children, and they didn't have any children. And we know the story from last week that God had miraculously provided the ability for Abraham's wife Sarah to conceive. They brought forth a son, and that is Isaac, the son of promise. Now, of course, there was some compromise and complications along the way, and sadly this is going to continue to happen through this family, and it's going to continue to happen through the human race. And the thing that we're to be looking out for is which descendant of Abraham is the one that is going to crush the serpent's head? Which descendant of Abraham is going to come and is going to remove sin from this world, is going to have victory, and is going to be able to bring about the ultimate triumph in which he will reverse the effects of the curse and turn pollution back to paradise? So this is what brings us now to Isaac. Isaac is the son of promise, born to both Abraham and to Sarah. Isaac is a very interesting character. We're going to learn a little bit about his marriage and children, but just as a way of introduction, Isaac marries Rebekah, and they're going to have 2 sons, twins, Jacob and Esau. And as we study the life of Isaac, we're going to learn that he has a very mixed life. It's a life of failure, but it's also a life of faithfulness. We'll look at some of the failures in just a moment, but let me briefly mention the faithfulness of Isaac that we might develop a little bit as we go along. But Isaac's faithfulness is seen in that, first of all, he was submissive to his father. You remember the story of Genesis 22, we spoke about it last time, when Abraham took Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him. Isaac was not a little boy, he was a man. So the fact that he willingly went with his father and willingly laid himself down on the altar shows that he submitted to his father. He knew the promises that God had made to his father. So he here is showing a a sense of faith, trust in the Lord, as he demonstrates that by submitting to his father. He also trusted the Lord for children. He also, like his dad, and this is interesting, he and his wife were unable to have children. And like his father, having that same difficult situation, but we see Isaac as a man who prays to God about it. He trusts the Lord and he looks to the Lord to provide because he believed in the promises made. He was also a man who had a consistent prayer life. And these are some of the strengths, the examples of faithfulness that we see in the life of Isaac. So let's begin with Isaac's marriage. Interestingly enough, Isaac did not get married until he was 40 years old. 40 years old. And at this particular time, when his dad, Abraham, was well advanced in years, he wanted his servant to go and find a wife for his son. So Abraham's servant, Eliezer, goes on an 800-kilometer journey back to their homeland to find a suitable wife for Isaac. Now you think about that. 800 kilometers. This is a significant trip. And he's been sent on the mission to find a wife for his master's son, for Isaac. And we get told that Eliezer is praying about this. He is looking to the Lord for guidance. He is looking for the Lord to open doors of opportunity. And you go over to Genesis 24 and you get the full story there. But he, in the end, comes to the conclusion that he is going to bring all of his thirsty camels. And when he gets to the place where camels can be watered at the well, he is going to look for the person that is going to come and is going to provide water for his camels, and not only do that, but provide enough water until they are full. This is going to be a very significant task. Now, if you know camels drink a lot of water, and he has a lot of camels, so this is going to be no small task. This is not just getting one little cup of water for somebody thirsty. This is going to be rigorous work. So a person to show initiative, volunteering to say, I'm going to look after you, I am going to water all of your camels, and as this man watches the lady pick up the jar, fill it up with water, and tip it down in the trough for the camels to drink, and then go back to the well multiple times, this is a huge task. Well, Eliezer gets to the location, and as he does that, there is one particular woman there. Her name is Rebecca. Rebecca does this. She shows a generous kindness, and she actually does exactly what the servant had prayed for. He now knows this is the one. This is the woman to marry my master's son. He then approaches her, and as he does this, Rebecca, after being praised by these actions with the servant Eliezer, goes back to her family. He informs them of the situation. The family acknowledge that this is God's will, that she is blessed, and she is to leave home and family to marry Isaac. Now, it's interesting. She is leaving family and her home to go to marry Isaac. She is leaving the same place Abraham left to fulfill God's promises. So you have a little bit of a repetitious pattern here. God called Abram, leave your family and your home and go to the place of promise. Rebecca's going to do the same location. Leave family and leave your home and go to a place of promise. She's going to marry Isaac. Now, we are told that she leaves, and as she arrives to the location where Isaac is, she is all covered up with a veil before the wedding. Isaac is informed that the two are to marry, and this marriage that takes place is a real high point in the book of Genesis. Because what this marriage shows us is that the promise God made to Abraham is beginning to be fulfilled. Because God promised that there will be many descendants. So if his son, who is now 40, doesn't get married and isn't going to have children, the promise isn't going to be fulfilled. So the fact that this wedding takes place, it is exciting. It is amazing because God's plan is unfolding. God's promises are being fulfilled. Now, what about their children? It's interesting that Isaac was 40 when they got married. Then for 20 years, Isaac and Rebekah were unable to have children. This is something that's in the family. Now remember, this is one of the effects of the curse. There's going to be complications in the world. And here we have the family that God has chosen, saying it's through this family that the nations are going to be blessed. Yet from a human perspective, this family hasn't got much to offer. Abraham and Sarah couldn't have kids until the Lord intervened. Here we see Isaac and Rebekah, again, members of the promise, unable to have children until the Lord does a great work. Now Isaac, we're told in Genesis 25 and verse 21, prayed to the Lord regarding this matter. And this is one of the signs of Isaac's faithfulness. He sees the difficult situation they're in. He sees the hardship that his wife is experiencing. But Isaac knows that God made a promise to his father. And Isaac knows that he is the son of the promise. So he prays to the Lord that God would provide children. This shows, again, the consequences of the curse, but God's plan to undo the curse by the promise to Abraham. We are told that after this, Rebekah conceives, and she is now carrying twins. Now it's interesting, in Genesis 25:22, we're told that the twins within Rebekah's womb struggled together. And this struggle is also a theme that's going to be repeated throughout the rest of the journey. This struggle is also one of the consequences of the curse or the fall. Remember that the Lord said to Adam, one of the consequences of the curse is the land. There's going to be problems with the land, disasters, famines, and it's going to be hard to work. He said to the woman, there's going to be complications with regards to birth. But what did he say to the serpent? There is going to be a conflict or a struggle between your seed and the seed of the woman. In other words, there is going to be a raging battle, a struggle between God's people and Satan's people. And these two children in the womb are struggling together. And we are seeing that this is the struggle between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. One of these children, his descendants will be a line that will be the seed of the serpent. And one of these children, their descendants will be the seed of the woman. So here we see a conflict raging. Well, as this occurs, we'll see this all fulfilled throughout the rest of the story. But then God reveals to Rebekah his sovereign plan for these two children. He says to Rebekah in Genesis 25:23 that in your womb are two nations. Yes, you've got two children, but these two children are going to represent two nations. Two peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. This now sets the stage for God's plan to pass on the promise made to Abraham, and it has now been repeated to Isaac. And of those two children, Jacob and Esau, which child is the child of promise? Jacob. Jacob will be the seed of the woman. It will be from Jacob's descendants that there will be the one who will come and crush the serpent's skull. Now, when these children were born, it's interesting that we learn that they have very different personalities and temperaments. Esau was a more outgoing outdoorsman, whereas Jacob was a more reserved homebody. Problems occur when Isaac begins to favor Esau, and Rebekah favors Jacob. This is then followed by that birthright incident. What happened there? Well, we're told there was a story where Esau went out. He was a mighty outdoorsman, a hunter, and he had been out all day. He obviously hadn't eaten any food, and he comes back all faint. He feels that he's going to die, and he says to his brother, "Make me some food. I am going to die from this experience." But then Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright." And then Esau, really dramatic, and says, well, what good is that? I'm going to die anyway. Fine, have my birthright. Just give me food. And then they make the arrangements. And then all of a sudden, Jacob makes the food for his brother and he is replenished. But what that episode showed was Esau actually disregarded the birthright. Esau was aware of the promises that God had made to his father, but also to his grandfather. But Esau is disregarding this. He doesn't really view the family birthright as something of high value at all. Now, it's interesting that all of this happens, and as time goes by, Esau begins to disregard the things of God, and Jacob begins to show deception. What ends up happening is when Isaac is now growing old, he's losing his vision, and the time comes to pass the blessing on to the children, Rebekah convinces Jacob that what he needs to do is he needs to go and pretend to be Esau so that he will receive the blessing. Jacob says, this is not going to work because my brother's really hairy. I'm a smooth man. And if Dad feels me, he's going to go, you're not Esau. So in the end, they end up killing an animal and getting the fur and putting it on him. So Esau was clearly a very hairy guy. And Jacob does this and goes to his father. His father, of course, will be thinking, this is not his voice, but let me feel you. Yep, this is my son. The special soup is made that he loved, and the mother had made this, and in the end, he receives the blessings. Esau is upset about all of this, and in the end, this very messy family dynamic, if they only just trusted the Lord from the beginning and understood that God said Jacob is the one that is to be blessed, if they honored the Lord rather than being manipulative through the situation, there wouldn't have been so many complications. But in the end, Isaac acknowledges that this is the right thing. So that's a little bit of an overview of Isaac. But what becomes clear with Isaac is a descendant of Abraham, but he is not the one who's going to reverse the curse. As faithful as he was in some part of his life, he also was a man of failure. We now then come to the next character, and that is Jacob. Jacob is the third major character in Genesis. Now let's quickly talk about Jacob's marriage. After he deceived his father and infuriated his brother, Jacob leaves home at the counsel of his mother and then seeks out a wife from the land where his uncle Laban, which is Rebekah's brother, lives. This is very similar to the instructions Abraham gave to his servant for his son's wife. Now, Jacob goes on this journey, and along the way, he stays at a certain place to have a sleep. And as he sleeps and rests, he has a dream of a ladder on earth that reaches all the way up into heaven. Let me read for you what happens in this occasion, because he sees angels coming up and down this ladder. Genesis 28, verses 13 to 15 says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it and said," so at the top of the ladder, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you, your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." What happens there? In this amazing announcement, the Lord is repeating the promise made to Abraham and was repeated to Isaac, and he's now passing it on to Jacob, saying, I am going to do this. I am going to bring the world back to paradise again, and it's going to come through your family. So the Lord has revealed himself to Jacob. This is incredible. Now Jacob finally arrives at the destination where his uncle Laban lives. Now Laban had two daughters. What are their names? Rachel and Leah. As soon as he arrives, he sees them both. Now Leah is the oldest and Rachel is the younger. But very quickly, Rachel captures the attention of Jacob. He sets his eyes upon her and sees how beautiful she is. Jacob then had an agreement with Laban that if he works for 7 years, he will be able to marry Rachel. And they had an agreement. So we are told that he does this. And the most romantic verse in the whole Bible appears in Genesis 29 and verse 20. You know what that is? It says that his affection was so strong that these 7 years seemed to him but a few days. How sweet. Okay, here is the lady that he wants to marry, and I don't care that I've got to work these 7 years because it is just going, you can just see he's digging, he's doing all this, but he sees her walk past, he sees her doing the watering. This is worth it. I'm going to marry her. Rachel is the apple of my eye. A real romantic, and how lovely and sweet for him. Now, after the 7 years had come, marriage day had now arrived. Now, you hear the saying, what comes around goes around, what you reap you sow. Remember, Jacob was a bit of a deceiver. Well, he's going to have that experience toward him now because his uncle deceives him. He has a daughter all veiled up, and you really can't really identify her very clearly for the day of the wedding, and he presents her to Jacob, and we find that after the morning after the wedding, he realizes that he has married the wrong one. He's married Leah. He had been deceived. Now, with a combination of darkness, veils worn, and a few other factors, he wasn't aware that this was the wrong one until the next day. After complaining, Laban then agrees, well, you can marry Rachel, but what has to happen is you've got to work with me for another 7 years. And this happens. Well, it doesn't have to say much to convince you that Jacob has a bit of a bad start to married life. All of a sudden, this man now has got 2 wives. One was one that he actually didn't want, and the other one is the one that he did want. You can imagine that this is going to result in rivalry, bitterness, complications. This is not going to be good, and this is getting this is a huge departure from God's intention. Remember back in Genesis 2, a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. He's now got 2 wives. This is not good. He should have learned lessons in his family of all the complications that had happened, but nonetheless, it is what it is. This family very quickly becomes dysfunctional and divided. Now, I want to show you an image to show you how divided this gets. What happens in the life of Jacob and his wives, Leah and Rachel, is we have what we could call the battle of the births. What is the battle of the births? Jacob loved Rachel, and he didn't show love toward Leah that he should have. But it's interesting that the Lord allowed Leah to have children, and Rachel couldn't have children. Over time, Leah gives birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel was crushed by this news. She's having children. I can't have any children. So filled with envy, she sent Jacob to go to her maidservant. Now, this is not going to end well. So, Jacob, you go to my maidservant, you have children with her. And in doing so, 2 children came as a result of this, Dan and Naphtali. You see them here. Responding to this, the battle of the births continues. Leah then says to Jacob, you go to my maidservant. And in doing so, 2 other boys were born, and we have Gad and Asher. Now, after a dispute, Leah buys the opportunity to lie with Jacob, and as a result of this, she bears a 5th son, which is Issachar. And after this, she conceived again and gave birth to her 6th son, which is Zebulun, and then she had a daughter named Dinah. So Leah has been quite fruitful, and we can see that during this whole time, Rachel has had no children. But the time finally comes when God does open Rachel's womb and allows her to conceive, and she gives birth to a son named Joseph. This was a dysfunctional time. This is not an ideal family. This is not the type of family you want to have a photo of on your fridge. It's going to look messy, okay? This is not good. It's not a go do likewise. This is an effect of the curse. Dysfunctional, messy, divided. But it's still the family that God is going to use to bring about his purposes. 11 sons and 1 daughter is born to Jacob during this time. Later on, Rachel will give birth to another son, and this will be her final child, and that, of course, is Benjamin, and she dies in the process of giving birth to him. In total, Jacob has 12 sons, and these 12 sons will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now later, God blesses Jacob and changes his name to Israel. And by doing this, this reaffirms the promise made to Abraham and to Isaac. And isn't it interesting that the promise that God made to Abraham, the covenant, was unconditional? Despite the failures and the sin of this family, God will come through with his covenant. So it becomes clear, just going back, when Abraham had Isaac, Isaac is not the one who's going to bring the world to paradise. Jacob, certainly not the one who's going to bring the world to paradise. But it's interesting that we now move to the final character, and that is Joseph. Joseph is the eldest son of Rachel. And when we learn about Joseph, Joseph, who is the 11th son of Jacob's 12 and Rebekah's firstborn, we learn that as a result of Jacob's deep love for Rachel, Jacob had a very special love for his son Joseph. And we learn about Joseph in Genesis 37 to 50. So he actually takes up a lot of the focus in the book of Genesis. Now, the story of Joseph is a stunning story that shows us that God is going to preserve this family despite their failures, because he made a promise to Abraham. The life of Joseph also gives us many practical lessons in terms of godly living. So let's quickly talk about Joseph. We begin, first of all, with the description of him being a man that was sold into slavery. Joseph comes on the scene in the book of Genesis when he was at the age of 17. And at the age of 17, we learn that Jacob, as a result of his special love toward him, gave this son a robe that was made up of many parts and colors. Now, he's going to stand out, isn't he, compared to his other brothers? It becomes clear this is the favored son. But God also had a plan in this, because God revealed himself to Joseph in a way that he didn't reveal himself to the other sons. And it was by means of dreams. Now, Joseph shared the dreams with his brothers. And the implication with all the dreams was that you're all going to bow down before me and I'm going to have a position of leadership. His brothers didn't really take that very well. Okay, they didn't like this guy. You get the coat. You're having these dreams that says you're better than us? That's not going to work. And in the end, these brothers all band together, and in the end, they sell him to some Ishmaelites. Now, isn't that interesting? Who are the Ishmaelites? Well, they were descendants of Ishmael. So we see that problem that occurred in the life of Abraham when he went in with Hagar and Ishmael was born. Now we're going to see that this is causing problems down the track, and Joseph, who is a descendant of Isaac, is now being sold to Ishmaelites. There is this conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And he's sold into slavery. Now, his brothers have a bit of a discussion about this and think, well, what are we going to tell father? Let's get his coat, let's tear it up, let's kill a goat, soak the coat in blood, and then bring it back and say, he got killed by wild beasts. We did all we could. It was so sad. They bring the news to their father, and Jacob was devastated by this news. Now, during all of this time, after the plot and the plan and now the betrayal, Joseph has been sold into slavery. Joseph finds himself in Egypt, and it's very interesting that when Joseph goes to Egypt, he gets bought by a very prominent man by the name of Potiphar. And Potiphar employs Joseph, and Joseph becomes a servant in his household. So while Joseph is now in Egypt, Joseph has a time of service in Egypt. And it's interesting that he goes from being a slave in Egypt to being the superintendent of Egypt. Now, no one would have seen this coming. Here is a young man from a land far away. He's in Egypt. He is in Potiphar's house, and he's a slave. And later on, he's going to become the great superintendent of all of Egypt. Now, how does this happen? Well, while he is working in Potiphar's house, we are told that the Lord was with him. The Lord prospered him. And Potiphar saw how hardworking he was and rewarded him and promoted him. And the day comes when a tragedy occurs. After being promoted, Potiphar's wife noted how handsome Joseph was. And she made all sorts of advances toward him. And after many attempts at seduction, Joseph refuses to lie with her and flees from the scene. Well, she doesn't want to accept this and makes accusations toward him. And as a result of this, Joseph gets thrown into prison. Now, I can't imagine how hard it would be for him because he's been sold, taken away from his family, and that would have been hard enough. Things were working out really well, and now he's in prison. And he's in prison for quite a while. Now, it's interesting, just note this, that Joseph's integrity of refusing to lie with Potiphar's wife is actually stated in contrast in Genesis 35 and 38 to the immoral actions of Reuben and Judah. So Joseph is seen as someone who's very different to them. Now, after all of this happens, Joseph is sent to prison and the situation seems bad, but we're told that the Lord was with him during this time. While he was in prison, Joseph happens to meet two men who used to work for Pharaoh, a cupbearer and a baker. And they have these troubling dreams. And they share them with Joseph, and Joseph says, well, I can actually tell you what these dreams mean. God gave Joseph this ability to do this. And as he tells them what these dreams mean, these men were quite amazed, but it was good news for one and bad news for the other. One was you're going to be restored to Pharaoh's staff, but you're going to die. The man who was going to be restored to Pharaoh's staff was the cupbearer. But Joseph said, but when you are restored, remember me. Remember me. Well, all of this happens. It's fulfilled. We get told that the baker does die, but the cupbearer begins to work for Pharaoh. And get this, not 2 weeks, not 2 months, but 2 years goes by. The cupbearer forgets about Joseph. But after 2 years goes by, Pharaoh starts having dreams. And they're troubling dreams. There are 7 great large cows, and then there are 7 skinny unfed cows, and the skinny unfed cows eat the big cows. What's going on? I don't understand this dream. It's troubling. Nobody can help me out. And then all of a sudden the cupbearer says, oh, Pharaoh, there is a man in the dungeon who I met 2 years ago. He actually told me what my dream meant, and it came true. You should talk to him. Thanks, cupbearer. It would have been nice to do that a little earlier, but this was the Lord's timing. So Pharaoh calls for him to come out, and Joseph stands before Pharaoh. Now get this. This is going to come out in the book of Exodus at the 3rd signpost. But historically, we are told that Pharaoh wore a particular hat. And you know what was on the top of his hat? A serpent. Here you have this man standing before a man wearing the serpent. We're going to see that there is going to be a raging battle, not between this Pharaoh and God's people, but later on between a Pharaoh and God's people. And it's going to show us the seed of the serpent is going to crush the seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's skull. So nonetheless, Joseph interprets this dream. And as a result of this, Pharaoh says, you are promoted. You are now the prime minister of Egypt. Prime minister. Going from slave to superintendent. This is unbelievable. This would have been stunning. And in the providence of God, a famine breaks out in the land, just as Joseph had interpreted in the dream. And not only does a famine break out in the land, guess where the famine goes to? Not just Egypt, it reaches Canaan. And that's where Jacob and all his sons are. Now they need food. And they get news, well, there is some really responsible prime minister in Egypt, and he has been saving up food for 7 years, so why don't we go and get food from Egypt? So Jacob says to his sons, I want you all to go, except for Benjamin, because I lost Joseph. All of you go, get food, here's the cash, bring it back. Well, they all go, and as they stand before the prime minister of Egypt, they don't recognize him because 20 years has gone by, and he's got his Egyptian garb on, no doubt the makeup. He looks pretty suave. And he's standing there, and he recognizes, these are my brothers. But they don't recognize him. And Joseph plays a little bit of a game with them. In the end, he asks for them to bring their youngest brother, because he holds them and makes some accusations towards them. Jacob didn't want this to happen, but in the end he was convinced. And it's interesting that during this time, one of the brothers particularly stands out, and he shows himself to be rather repentant, and it's Judah. And as all of this happens, in the end, and it's a long story, and you can read more about it in Genesis, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. And he says to his brothers, you meant this evil toward me, but God meant it for good, because God had a plan. And the plan was that he was going to preserve his people. And by you coming here, and now that I have a position of authority, I am going to invite my whole family into Egypt, and you guys are going to be looked after. This family that God made a promise to, back to our father Jacob, to Isaac, and also to Abraham, God has raised me up so that this family can be preserved, and in the midst of difficult times in this world, we're going to be okay. And that family lived in Egypt, and they were blessed. They grew to a very large family. And it's interesting that in the rest of the book of Genesis, we learn that God isn't going to carry the line through Joseph. Joseph has sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But the son of this family that God's going to continue this line through is Judah. And we are actually told when Jacob speaks to Judah and he gives blessings to all his sons, he says to Judah, from you are going to come kings. And that means ultimately there will be a king. So the point is, Joseph, as impressive as he is, isn't the one. We are still waiting for the one who is going to deliver this family and deliver the world from sin. So that brings us to the end of this particular signpost number 2, and we'll pick up next time with signpost 3.